Hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah Mintz. I'm the event coordinator at the bookstore, and Community is currently celebrating over 50 years in business, and we credit the continued support of readers and writers for this milestone. Thank you for spending the evening with us. I'm thrilled today to be partnering once again with our friends at New York Review Books to welcome translator Esther Allen and Andrés Barba for a discussion of Antonio Di Benedetto's novel, The Silentiary, available now in Esther's translation from NYRB Classics. To some housekeeping, we've enabled Zoom's auto-transcribe settings so you can hit the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. If you have any questions for tonight's guests, please click on the Q&A button, also at the bottom of your screen, to submit them. We use that rather than the chat, helps keep things organized. I will be using the chat to post a link to buy tonight's book if you haven't already. And one caveat for tonight's event is that we are all at the mercy of our home internet connections, so please bear with any technical issues that might arise. We'll try to resolve them quickly. We also have a great lineup of events planned to get you through these 6 more weeks of winter and beyond. So head to our website, communitybookstore.net, sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. 2 that I want to point out in particular are on Saturday, February 19th. We're thrilled to welcome Nobel laureate Olga Tokarczuk and translator Jennifer Croft for The Books of Jacob in conversation with Rabbi Alameddin. And the following Wednesday, February 23rd, we'll be hosting Alejandro Zambra and translator Megan McDowell to discuss the novel Chilean Poet in conversation with Francisco Goldman. Those programs are up on our website now and taking registrations. Now, a little about tonight's guests, and we'll get started. Esther Allen received the 2017 National Translation Award for her translation of Antonio Di Benedetto's Zama. Co-founder of the Penn World Voices Festival in New York City, she teaches at City University of New York's Graduate Center and Baruch College. In 2006, the French government named her a Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters. Her essays, reviews, and translations have appeared in the New York Review of Books, the Paris Review, Words Without Borders, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, Granta, and other publications. Andrés Barba is the author of more than 15 books of literary fiction, essays, and poetry. Among his titles available in English are Such Small Hands, The Right Intention, Reign Over Madrid, August, October, and A Luminous Republic. His latest book, for which he received a fellowship at the Cullman Center of the New York Public Library, is a biography of the architect Rafael Guastavino. He was selected by Granta magazine as one of the best young Spanish novelists. Now, without any further ado, I'll hand it off to you two. Esther, Andrés, thank you both so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Noah.
Thank you. Do you want to start? Do you want me to start?
Yeah. Why don't you start? I want to hear you introduce Antonio Di Benedetto. Tell me about Antonio Di Benedetto, Andrés.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to your presentation. I really enjoyed the book. I must say it was a book by Di Benedetto I haven't read before. So it's been a great chance to know more about him. And thank you, Community Bookstore, for having this wonderful presentation with Esther. I'm going to make just, as Esther said, a brief introduction to Antonio Di Benedetto, who is like a very, very interesting Argentinian writer from the 20th century, and a very particular one, I may say. He was born in 1922 and died in 1986. So as you can imagine, he was, as a writer, in the middle of the Latin American boom, but he was not part of it. I mean, he was not one of the well-known authors as Cortázar, García Márquez, Vargas Llosa, etc. He studied law and worked as a journalist almost his entire life. And he was at the very end of his career as a journalist, deputy editor of Los Andes, a well-known journal in newspaper here in Argentina. And most of all, he's the author of a trilogy of books, most admired by authors like Borges, Sabato, etc., composed by Zama, The Silentiary, y Los Suicidas is the third one. The first 2 of them have been translated by Esther, and they composed, the 3 of all, a trilogy called the Trilogy of Awaiting. Correct me if I'm wrong, please, Esther.
Yes, I translated it as the Trilogy of Expectation.
Expectation, that's wonderful. That's better, much better. And it is so interesting for the beginning how this book and these three books belongs to a tradition, very interesting about the very fact of being waiting for something. I was thinking in books like Waiting for Godot, classics like Waiting for Godot, or No One Writes the Colonel, or what was the title in English? The Tartar's Tip by Dino Buzzati, for example. All of them classics, all of them written around that period. And it's so interesting how at that time there was something on being waiting for, that it was in the air for some reason. We will talk about that. He was in prison during the dictatorship in Argentina in 1976. Was one of the most traumatic events of his life. He spent 1 year in prison, and during that year he had 4 simulated executions with the shooting squad. And the most amazing thing about his being in prison is he never knew why he was in jail for. It's almost like this is something that very often happens in literature, like Di Benedetto is himself a character of a Di Benedetto's novel in a way. So when he went out of jail, he was exiled from Argentina. He went to Paris, Madrid, and he came back to Argentina when the democracy was declared and died in 1986. That is, I mean, his life is, as a writer, he was not as well known as his companions, like Cortázar or Sabato or Borges, because in a way he was so European to be a part of the punch of the Latin American boom. This is something that is quite interesting, and we can discuss later about this, but how a culture like English-speaking tradition that has so less room for authors from other cultures, such a small room for literature in translation, how do we look for authors that in a way they respond to the prejudice we have about these countries? For instance, an author that is not so much Latin American as Di Benedetto, who looks more like a French or a German author, it would be like in the first row for being translated into English, because he was not according to the what is supposed to be an Argentinian writer. He was very close to the existentialist movement in spirit. He was very inspired by Kafka, Dostoevsky, Pirandello, of course, Dino Buzzati, Robert Musil, all of these Central European writers, but also these existentialist philosophers, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, etc. As Esther described, his style is not quite Latin American, neither Borges sounds like very Latin American in a way, but he's kind of a cerebral, sober, non-sentimental, aloof in a way. Esther talks about understatedness, which is a word I didn't know. Cerebral. His writing is made of a very editing. It's a very editing writing. You always have the feeling that there is like you're reading just 1/3 of the original text that was written. He was taking out a lot of text, and you can feel all the presence and the energy that all the text that is not there, but you can feel the presence, the presence that it was gone, that it was taken away. As in Borges, I may say, you have the same feeling that all this gap it was there. On the other hand, I think he belongs to a tradition of, I would say, symbolic realism, which is literature that is written in, let's say, realistic terms with a realistic structure, but you can feel the density of a pure symbolic writing. I was thinking of authors, of course, like Kafka. You can think of The Trial, for instance, to make an idea of how it sounds Di Benedetto's writing, but also Eastern tradition, like The House of the Sleeping Beauties by Kawabata, of course, The Tartar Steppe by Dino Buzzati, Bartleby, the Scrivener, for example, would be another good example of this type of writing, that you have the feeling that you're reading a realistic story written in symbolic terms, so to speak. So I think that would be the clue for a good reading of Antonio Di Benedetto. The other big question is how he's being legitimized in this situation of how it's been a long period for us to get to know better Antonio Di Benedetto in this situation. And I think the beautiful thing about Di Benedetto in a way is he's been claimed by writers more than readers in the first instance. He's been a writer for writers in a way. As is, for example, I was thinking in American examples, and I would say, for instance, Richard Yates, for example, who was very well-known author in his time, but he was claimed by other writers as his writer. Or would be, for instance, in the last years, something that happened with Clarice Lispector, for instance, who is a classic in the Brazilian literature, and he was barely known for the Americans till 2-3 years ago, I'll say. This is what happened with Antonio Di Benedetto, and it is beautiful that this kind of legitimization is kind of slower, but in the other hand, is more steady. He's definitely one of the most amazing writers of the 20th century in Argentina, and he is an author that everybody has to read now. So you cannot take like out of the question of Antonio Di Benedetto. He's now in the canon, and it's been the fact that his entrance in the canon has been slower. It becomes that is more steady in a way. So I think that would be like a super brief, because I want more Esther to speak here. Introduction to Antonio Di Benedetto, and please, I would love to hear you a little bit, and maybe then we can start a conversation about the book, if you will.
And maybe we can even read a little bit from the book.
Yeah, sure.
Anyway, I just want to say it's such a pleasure to have you here, Andrés. And I have to point out that Andrés, this is the perfect conversation about Antonio Di Benedetto, because Andrés is joining us from Posadas Misiones, which is a remote region of Argentina, where it is currently summer. So those of you joining from the East Coast of the United States, where I am, can admire his relaxed appearance and his tan, short-sleeved, air, and just sort of drink it up. It's the one advantage of Zoom that we get exposed. Yes, Susan, envy. And I also have to say hello to one of the living translators from the Spanish that I most admire on the planet, Chris Andrews, who is here from Australia, joining us from Sydney, where it must be very early in the morning. I'm so honored that Chris is here with us. He's one of the people whose work I most treasure and cherish, a wonderful translator, a wonderful writer, a wonderful poet. And I'm not even going to look at the rest of the names on the list, because then we would just get into greetings, and we are not here to do that. So I want to respond to some of the things that Andrés said about Antonio Di Benedetto. I love the word aloof. I love that you use that word aloof. And he's absolutely a writer's writer. And I think that his sort of recapturing after he dies in more or less in obscurity, although he receives this big award right before he dies. And then he fades, and then it's people like Bolaño, Pilia, Saer. It's a younger generation of Argentine writers who are also, and I think this has to be underscored, I think that they are reacting against magical realism. Because you are absolutely right that he uses a sort of symbolic realism, but it is never magical. And I think in this moment when magical realism had become sort of the definition internationally of Latin American literature, Di Benedetto became a refuge against magical realism, which is, and I want to get to the reading in a second, but which is a little odd, because if literature has a real magic, Di Benedetto's writing has a power that is extremely rare, and that I find to be actually magical. And it is a magic of perception. It is a magic of foresight. It is a magic of structure. And it is also an explanation for why I call the trilogy of expectation, rather than the trilogy of awaiting. So I just want to say a few words about this idea that this is a trilogy also, because in Di Benedetto's mind, it was not a trilogy. Di Benedetto wrote 3 novels, over the span of about 15 years, and he never called them a trilogy. I actually had this conversation with a dear friend of Susan's and mine, Breon Mitchell, who's an expert in Beckett. And of course, Beckett also has 3 novels written more or less around the same time period. And his publisher decides that Malloy, Malone Dies, and The Unnameable are a trilogy. Beckett never said that they were a trilogy. And Beckett says, okay, you can publish them in 1 volume, but don't use the word trilogy. So they have permission to publish the 3 in 1 volume, but the word trilogy is forbidden. Di Benedetto never had a chance to give his assent to the idea that this is or isn't a trilogy, because he was dead when Juan José Saer decided in a preface to El Silentiary, the Silentiary, written, I think, in the late 90s, that these were a trilogy. But the perception that they are a trilogy is such a brilliant perception, because it makes you read them differently. Yeah. And it also builds this structure that is like these nesting boxes. Because Zama, those of you who know Zama, and I'm assuming that many of you are here because you read Zama and that brought you to this book, of course, is tripartite. And the chapters just have the names of years, and they're very evocative years. 1791, 1796, 1799. And what the reader of Zama brings to the names of those years is a sense of their significance that the reader does not share with the main character. The main character is trapped in Paraguay. The main character shows no evidence of being aware of the French Revolution, no evidence of being aware in 1799 that Napoleon has become first consul, no evidence of any awareness that Napoleon becoming first consul is going to lead to the conquest of Spain, which is going to lead to the independence of the American states of South America, which is going to lead to the utter demise of the entire centuries-old structure that for Zama is just his reality, unchanging, impossible ever to change. So there's this dual perception within the novel, what awaits Zama that we know awaits him because we know the history, and his life, which is stuck in this present reality that he's desperately trying to get out of. So what happens then when you think of these 3 novels as a trilogy, and as a trilogy of expectation, is that the same thing happens historically within the history of Argentina, but they operate as a prediction, because they lead up to the Dirty War and Di Benedetto's imprisonment, but they were all written before. Yeah. And they lead up to, through this like long-term historical sequence. Zama is, of course, the 18th century. The Silentiary well, I'll talk a little bit about the temporality of the Silentiary because that's a very complex thing. But it's basically the 50s, maybe a little bit the early 60s. It's published in 64. And then Los Suicidas takes place exactly contemporary with when we're in the present moment in which the novel is being written. And there's all sorts of references to that present moment, films, books. It's just very, very, very contemporary, immersed in its own contemporaneity. And then the Dirty War happens and affects Di Benedetto personally. And so then it becomes impossible in retrospect to read these books as inconclusive, or as history imposes its own kind of meaning on this sequence, this temporal sequence, exactly as Di Benedetto deliberately does with Zama. But of course, he can't possibly know that that's going to happen with these three novels. So there's something that's extremely uncanny in Di Benedetto's writing, not magical realism, but a sort of historical uncanny. That I think is very rare, and that you can't create. You just have to sort of create a porous text that is attentive to movements in history and that is elusive enough, you know, to be borne along in this way. And he did that. And of course, it was not good for him that this happened. It was terrible for him. It was the worst thing that ever happened to him. So in some sense, we would all wish for his sake that these books did not have this uncanny quality, but history gave them that stamp. And so now that becomes part of how we receive them. This is particularly true. Well, maybe I'll say a little bit about that afterwards, but there's a very interesting thing about the Silentiary that sets it apart within the trilogy, because El Silenciero, and I hadn't really realized this until I started translating the book, isn't really one novel, it's two novels, because there is a version that was published in 1964, and I went to Mendoza, I went to the library of the Universidad de Cuya, and I have this like funny little photocopy that my dog chewed up, my dog's satellite chewed up a page. That is the 1964 version of the novel, which I consulted while I was translating it. And then you have the 1975 version of the novel, which Di Benedetto changed a lot. And he changed the temporality of the novel. For example, to just give you one example, he added television. In the 1964 version of the novel, there's no television. And it's just radio and cars. And at some point, one character says to another, "What year are we in?" And the other character says 1948. So it's actually much earlier. And then in the 1975 version of the novel, which of course is just 1 year before, as Andrés pointed out, 1976, when the dirty war breaks out, he gets arrested, he goes to jail. There's television. It's not 1948, it's the years 1950 and thereafter in this strange epigraph that he adds. And there is a lot more it's not huge changes. I wouldn't say that it's a much longer novel. It's definitely a slightly longer novel. Some things are taken out, as Andrés said, some things are added. But it's a much darker novel. And if I just want to share screen because I just want to show you, I have here a cover. Can I share screen? Let me just try. Do you guys see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so I have here the cover. Do you see the cover of the, this is the cover of the first edition, the 1964 edition. And obviously it's a man, he has a head between his hands, but it's comic, right? There's a cat looking at him. It's a cartoonish comic sort of cover. Yeah. And the first novel has almost that feel, you know, this is like a funny guy. Of course, he does end up in jail. So it's not that funny. And there is this weird terrorist plot with the lion tamer and everything that weaves through it. But this is the sensibility of the first novel. And then let me just show you the second one, or this is actually a later edition. This isn't even the second edition in 1975, but this is just to give you an idea of how apt he was to continue transforming his own work, not just abandoning it to be transformed by history, as history always transforms literary work, but operating on it, continuing to rewrite it. So this is the 1985 cover. And you can see that it's like a completely different book. Like the man is clutching his head in his hands, but it says una inmersión lúcida en el hombre asediado por el ruido físico y el ruido metafísico. So it's melodramatic, it's very dark, it's existential, as Andrés pointed out, and it has a different title, El Hacedor de Silencio, which he then changed again and went back to El Silenciero. And it's sort of interesting because I thought that all of these major, this is my stumbling on the uncanny, and I have to make a confession here and thank the people at the New York Review of Books. I understood that there were all these major changes between this early version that I got in a photocopy in Mendoza and the version I was translating, but I thought it was this edition, the 1984 edition. And I thought he'd been transformed by the experience of the Dirty War, and he went back and changed the novel, and it was commentary and made it much darker. No, he made all the changes except for the title in 1975, before being in prison. So it's truly uncanny. And it sort of gives me chills. Like I knew he had made the changes in 1985, but I replaced that in my mind with 1975, excuse me. But I replaced that in my mind with 1984 because I was so, it was too uncanny to sort of accept that was.
Esther, may I interrupt you just a second?
Absolutely.
Just for the people who are hearing us, I think it would be great just to get to know an idea about what is the book about, what is the novel about, just a brief idea of the plot, not spoilers, no nothing, but just a brief idea. I think we can tell just to picture out better what is the book.
Okay, great. I will give you a very brief idea of the plot, and then let's read from it. Okay, shall we read? Okay. All right. So basically, it is a man who is like Zama, an employee who has a certain amount of power, but who is not the boss, a sort of second-tier employee. He's not a bureaucrat. He's in a corporate situation. But in some ways, he's also the inversion of Zama, because Zama is exiled, he misses his wife, he misses his mother. This man lives with his mother, takes a wife, lives in his hometown where he was born, but at the same time is trying to escape from something in just the same way as Zama is, but his escape is much more difficult because what he wants to escape from is noise. And he needs to find silence because he has this dream of writing a book. And he can't seem to find the silence that he feels is the precondition for being able to write his book. And so the book is all about these noises that assail him. In fact, my husband was threatened to walk through the room as we were having this conversation, banging on pots and pans so everyone would have the experience. And he eventually marries. He even has a child. And he starts becoming more and more proactive against noise. But in the end, he doesn't really take any of the steps that he's thinking of taking to avenge himself on the people who are making his life miserable with noise. But he ends up looking as if he did. And so he ends up in jail. So there's that uncanny as well of like, he ends up in jail and what happens to the author afterward, everything. So just to give you a little, Andrés, do you want to read that paragraph that we talked about?
Sure.
And then I'll just read a little bit of a longer passage.
Okay, let me check. I just took a picture of it. I have to find the picture.
One, I think it's the viento.
Yeah, it's here. This is a very brief fragment of the book. ¿Es un viento entubado que baja y sube los tonos según el arrebato de su ira? Es agua, un chijete poderoso y variable, tal vez empujado por una corriente de aire que silba al salir y rompe chocando con la chapa. La ablución, el primer rito. Lavan autos con alguna máquina de propulsar agua y así empiezan la mañana y el primer trabajo del taller. A mediodía siguen lavando coches. Regreso a las 8 de la noche. Se hacen las 10:30 y ellos avanzan sobre todos los horarios de la jornada legal, del momento razonable de comer. Parecen entregados a una pasión por higienizar todo lo que lleve 4 ruedas y un motor. Hace frío, pero tengo ardiente la cabeza.
Okay, so I'm just going to read a little bit more to give you an idea of this character. This is from the first section of the novel. The novel has 2 sections, so we're still at the beginning here. It's page 29 in the book. Is it wind trapped inside a tube that pitches the tone higher or lower according to the intensity of its rage? No, it's water, a powerful variable jet, perhaps propelled by forced air. It emerges with a hiss and disperses when it hits the metal. The ablution, the first ritual. They're washing cars with some machine that sprays water. Thus does the morning, and with it, the repair shop's first job begin. At noon, they're still washing cars. I come home at 8 p.m. Soon it's 10:30. They encroach upon every hour of the day, the legal working hours, the reasonable hour for lunch. They seem to have abandoned themselves entirely to their passion for the hygiene of all that has 4 wheels and an engine. It's cold, but my head is burning. In the morning before I leave, their daily tasks generally begin at 7. They're not washing any cars, nor at noon. They're there. I can hear their conversations, now devoid of exuberance, as if they were restraining themselves. Maybe they won't get much work, my mother ventures. They seem to be a small operation. They're new and obviously still unknown, but people will find them. The sign on the door is enough. They'll build a clientele. I'm stubborn in my refusal to speak a word of hope, though inside I do have some hope, a hope against hope that the business will fail. In the evening, I acknowledge the possibility that Nina is holding back, waiting for me, but I avoid the spot. I don't know whether today, again, the repair shop will destroy the peace I crave at my dinner time and afterward, and I would be incapable of saying anything on a perfunctory or neutral topic. The search for the right key among all of them, my mother, out of an abundance of caution, locks up early, becomes a trying task. I realize that anxiety is destroying me. I open the gate to the courtyard. The shop's zinc roof is dark. I need to sleep. I will sleep a lot until 7 the next morning. If it weren't for the noise, I wouldn't have these memory lapses. If I hadn't forgotten some papers, I wouldn't have gone home in mid-morning to get them. If I hadn't gone home at that unusual hour, I wouldn't have known, as I now do, that they also repair loudspeakers, producing squawk after squawk to check tone, intensity, and volume, sometimes mimicking the soundtracks of popular films as they do this. My mother was spending her days under a bombardment of loudspeaker blasts. I fled. That night, I flee again, going straight from the office to the restaurant, though it's early still. While I wait, I have a vermouth, too. A few of us who were very friendly at school get together from time to time. We toss whatever's happened to us between one dinner and the next onto a kind of common discard pile, along with a reproducible flight of fancy or 2. Lately, we've also started bringing along other guests, perhaps to save these gatherings from the strain of our own mediocrity. Any of us can bring someone, and the check, the guest's check, is shared among us all. Gutierrez introduces Reato, a journalist. Franklin presents Pastor Flores, a folk singer. The musician is a man of some renown. His earliest records are older than any of us. Reato might also be considered someone, but only a few people, myself among them, know who writes for the papers. A journalist? For which paper? The best one. And he names the daily paper that is most widely read and offers the most thorough coverage. My conviction that I can write is not based on any contact whatsoever with writers, only with books. In school, a literature professor of mine was a writer. He never recognized me. In the neighborhood where I used to live, a gentleman with a full head of graying hair seemed very much like everyone else. After moving away from that street, I saw his picture in a magazine. He was poet number 3. The second best novelist once sat at this very table. The daily paper's calendars of events have sent me off to join temporary congregations formed to listen to half a dozen of the nation's other writers. But that's the extent of it. So the sudden proximity of reato, a man who writes, sets me on fire. I want to be seen. Therein lies my perdition. I challenge Pastor Flores, who has bolstered his fame as a singer and guitarist with countless bottles of wine. I claim I can drink more than he can. Some of the others keep a tally of glasses served and downed. The race lasts from the beginning of the meal to its end. Well before dessert, I've grown befuddled, but I know I've won or will win. I can still make out the meaning of a few phrases. Pastor Flores' words aim to diminish my victory. He got ahead of me even before they brought out the cold cuts. Typical of a lousy drinker, starting hard on an empty stomach. Does he live nearby? You know that you're all going to have to carry him home. I agree. The inaccurate or perhaps simply false account given to my mother when I was delivered home in the early hours of the morning seems to have established, one, that I enjoyed myself enormously, and because everyone was having fun, everything turned out fine. Two, that I brought honor to our little gang by emerging victorious from a fierce competition. Three, that as we took our leave, there was a slight incident without consequences, which contradicts the first point. I have no memory of the slight incident, but I do know it involved blows given and received. As might be expected, some parts of my face maintain a more vivid record of the night's events. Moreover, I note that an impulse towards violence still runs through me. I feel like a fighter. Day has developed in my window panes. I'm in bed and the shop's noise is behind me. But even as I hear it, my mind, my muscles, and my blood are still benighted and under the reign of Bacchus.
Nice. I would love to talk a little bit about silence and the meaning of silence in this novel. It is very, I mean, to me, it is a bit, silence here is a little bit like the white color in Moby Dick. It is a very symbolic element in a way, but at the same time, it's like an empty category. It's like a blank. And because of it doesn't mean nothing in particular, it can mean like anything. So, and it's very interesting also these things you have told before, and I would love you to talk a little bit more about this. How Benedetto changed the title of the novel in the second edition for the silence maker, and then again back to the Silentiary. El silenciero actually is not a word in Spanish. It doesn't exist as a word. And it is to me like in changing the title, Benedetto thought that he was explain too much the joke, and back to the joke again without like preferring not to talk a little bit too much about. And I would love to talk to you about a bit about how in this novel silence is something that you make, you construct, you look for, you with the law in your hand or with all the elements you can achieve. It's something you can. And the interesting and super modern about this novel is you're trying to get silence in order to write, supposedly, but actually the writing thing is always in an expectation situation all the time. So there is a never arriving situation with the silence. And on the other hand, we have this concept of noise. Noise is equivalent to life in this novel. So that makes the character in a way a freak who is all the time trying to like escaping from life in a way. So I would love you to speak a little bit. What do you think about this conceptual thing in the novel about silence?
Well, as you point out, it's a paradox, right? I mean, you can't construct words, that are silent, because then they wouldn't be words, and even words on a page have, although he does talk about the difference between the radio, someone reading a newspaper and someone listening to the radio. So there is the written and oral, and the written is silent. And so he needs silence in order to produce silent writing. And he constructs silence on the page in lots of interesting ways. The things that fascinates me about this novel is the absolutely obsessive use of ellipses, which there are no ellipses in Zama, but El Silenciero has its own kind of punctuation. Like he invents a different punctuation. And the punctuation is a punctuation that beckons silence, right? Like the ellipses tells you something is left out here, something is not said. It's a way of like emphatically insisting. But they're also a kind of visual representation of an element of the novel that becomes more and more important as it progresses. This is the symbolic realism that Andrés talks about, which is flies. Because at the end, there's this moment when someone kills a fly, and it has this incredible symbolic weight, right? Like the fly is the world, the fly is the sign, the fly is so many different things. And in some sense, these ellipses are like little fly specks on the page. So there's actually a kind of strong visual thing between these black dots and this element of the plot of the novel. But with regard to El Silenciero, even Saer says it's a neologism. Everybody says it's a neologism. It's actually in the Maria Moliner. Really? It's an archaic word, and silenciary is also in the Oxford English Dictionary. They are archaic terms that are so archaic that they've been forgotten. Yeah. And they are actually terms that were primarily used. I think that, in England, in maybe the 18th century, there would be a Silentiary who would go through the streets of villages calling for silence. But the origin of the term, as far as I know, is the Byzantine court, where there was an official in Byzantium whose job it was to impose silence in the presence of royalty, silence and that person was called the Silentiary, or the Latin term, the Latin equivalent thereof. So they're both taken from that Latin term. And there is this character, Bessarion, who is very emphatically named, while the narrator of the novel is not named. And Bessarion has this very strange name. People in the novel comment on how strange his name is. And it's the name of a disciple of Saint Anthony, the early Christian ascetic. And so, again, we're back in this period of early Christianity that the title itself alludes to, although nobody recognizes the allusion, right? So it's very interesting how Di Benedetto, in these very subtle ways, and then he seems to have decided to abandon that with El Hacedor de Silencio, but he's always very nervous about his titles. He changes his titles a lot. He never changed Zama, but other titles, and some of his titles are horrible. He had a book called Grot. That was literally the title, entre comillas, Grot. And then I think someone said, that's really a bad title for a novel. And he changed it to Cuentos Claros, which means sort of like bright stories or clear stories.
Is that the one who that wrote in jail? It was that.
No, that was called Absurdos, which is a title which he did not change. Yeah. But he kept messing with his titles, especially of the earlier books. And some of them ended up completely different from the original. In the case of El Silenciero, he makes this one change, then it changes back. So that's like another thing. And, again, the way that he uses silence is leaving so much unsaid, leaving the text so porous, leaving these ellipses, and just basically trying to, there's lots of talk about dreams, which is another area of silence within the book, very opaque. And I think that there's also a way in which the narrator comes to understand at the end that his use of silence has been a weapon, and that his insistence on silence has been a weapon, and that as much as he felt harmed by the world, he has harmed other people in the world, that he's seen himself as the innocent victim of the world intruding upon him, these intrusions of noise that keep happening, but that he himself has also intruded upon others people's lives. There's this incredible phrase where he says, an instrument of not allowing to be. He calls noise an instrument of not allowing to be. And towards the end, there's a moment where perhaps there's some realization that it's not just that others have not allowed him to be, but that he has also not allowed others to be.
Noise is also an equivalent to stupidity in a way.
Yes.
That's very important for the narrator in a way, right?
And noise is like the delusion of the world, the violation of this sacred inner space that he wants to preserve. And that's why I think the allusion via the name Bessarion to the temptation of Saint Anthony is important, because it's this delirium of the world, of the temptations of the world presented before you, and you're trying to retain your inner chastity, right? There's a kind of inner thing that he doesn't want to betray, and that the noise is constantly violating. So in that sense, I think that the novel is so unpretentious, it's so taciturn, it does so little to sort of try and impress the reader in the flagrant ways that writers try and impress readers. But I do think that those are the measure of his intentions, that it's not exaggerated to compare it to, an ancient tradition of the temptation of Saint Anthony, and talk about it at the same time as you talk about Flaubert or Bosch or.
Yeah. Just a brief question, last question, and then we can open the discussion if you want. I was very impressed about the presence of bureaucracy in this book. And it's very important. I think it's a sign of the times in a way, but it is important. It is very important, I think, for the narrator, the presence of the law and the weight of the law and how he can use the law to make the silence appear and everything. I would like you to know your opinion about the presence of, do you think it's a politic purpose, this notion of bureaucracy and law and everything, or?
Well, it's really interesting. At some point, he starts actually becoming a political activist via this journalist that he meets at this dinner, and they start publishing things about the plague of noise in the paper. And here I have to show you this. It's really kind of interesting how Di Benedetto is so prescient about media, because these little tiny texts that they publish in the paper, the journalist, the Silentiary just supplies these texts. I don't know if you can, if it's possible to see, but anyway, it's on page 94, 95 of the novel. And it's just these little tiny bits of news in sequence. And when I was translating it, I was like, this is like a Twitter feed. This is just like random pieces of information, appearing on a screen, but it's in a novel that was written in 1964, right? So he has this prescience about media that I think is amazing, but he's a journalist, so that's actually how he spends his life. And then the bureaucratic part of it is very subtle here, but the Silentiary keeps appealing to the police to be the mechanism of suppressing noise, and consistently the police are the source of noise rather than a mechanism for suppressing noise. So, in someone who's living in a country that is blossoming into a totalitarian police state, right? I think there's a certain amount of, it's in a very low key level, right? Like he goes to the police and they don't hear the noise, or they don't think the noise is important. But then a police station opens up next to him, and the policemen listen to the radio all night to keep themselves awake on the ship. So it is not like he's saying, and he's living through Perón, he's living through these terrible, the Dirty War is preceded by terrible years in Argentine history. He never mentions those political figures. He never mentions anything that's in the newspapers except for these trivial faits divers. People are reading newspapers, but we don't know what the news is. We never mention a real political figure. And yet somehow working in the plot that the police consistently are the source of the problem rather than a solution to impose order. It seems like, a very, very sort of oppression thing. And of course, his vision of politics is dismissed in like a second. The journalist publishes these things about noise, they're popular, the journalist gets elected to the city council. The moment he gets elected to the city council, he has no further interest in noise. He celebrates his position, becomes prosperous as a member of the city council, and does nothing more about the issue that placed him there. And it's just a sort of toss off aside. So that's kind of, the novel's take on political solutions.
Okay, if you will, we can, do you want to do this?
Yeah, no, you wanna tell us what the questions are?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this this conversation. This has been fascinating. I'll be thinking a lot about Benedetto's Twitter feed, to be sure. Now to start us off, it looks like we have a question from translation question from Christopher Clark. They say, "Hi Esther, my question: having spent so much time finding the tone for Zama, did you find Benedetto's tone shifted a great deal with the move from the late 18th century to the 1950s? And if so, how did you go about adjusting to the feel to compensate? Were the similarities and approaches in style that you worked to maintain, or did you approach the Silentiary more in isolation?"
A great question, Chris, another dear, dear friend and a brilliant translator in the audience. Well, Zama has a voice that is unique within Di Benedetto's work because it has this pseudo-archaic thing going on. That was a huge challenge because it's not actually written in 18th century prose, but it sort of signals towards 18th century ways of speaking and summons that up in some pages. And it's it's interesting because anybody who looked at a page of Zama and a page of El Silentiary would probably say these are by the same writer. Like there would be enough that was recognizable. Saer says that, Di Benedetto's prose style is his greatest contribution to Argentine literature, and that it emerges perfect, like Eve from Adam's rib, or I don't know if that's the thing that he compares it to. But at the same time, Chris, you're absolutely right. This is an incredibly different prose style in El Silentiary than in Zama. So I think the thing that you need to do is respect the particularity of the individual book, while at the same time trying to remain within the stylistic register that you developed for the earlier book. And that's what I tried to do. But there were certain words, it was really interesting because in Zama, there's all this talk about America. But for Zama in the 18th century, America is the Spanish Empire, is nothing but the Spanish Empire. So that was a really difficult word for me to translate, because if I say Zama is an American, for an audience in the United States in the 21st century, that's going to sound very odd to many people. So I actually translated the word as Americano. I translated as Americano as Americano and Zama, because I wanted to educate my audience about what Americano was for Zama, like how the word was used and what this alternate America of the Spanish Empire was. And I felt that was what I had to do. But in El Silentiary, for example, America is both Latin America, and Latin America is mentioned in the opening epigraph, and it's also the United States. It's taken on this dual meaning. So at some moments in the book, the narrator's mother says we were in America, and she means she means Mendoza, she means Argentina, she means we were not in Italy, we were in America. And at other moments they talk about American music is playing, and they mean music from the United States, they mean foreign music. So the word in El Silentiary has the exact valence that it has today in Latin America, where people will say America meaning Latin America, but they'll also use America for the United States. So with this translation, I stuck with America for those passages. So I had to take into account the time period a lot in creating the voice and the register.
That's fascinating. Thank you for that. And a great question from Chris, so thank you. Another good question from Marco Solis, and this could be for both of you perhaps, is first of all, nice to be here and thank you. And they mentioned the homage of Roberto Bolaño to Di Benedetto. And I'm wondering if you could talk about other influences that you see in Latin American literature or beyond that Di Benedetto has had.
Andrés, do you want to take that one?
Well, what was I know Roberto Bolaño had a big correspondence with Di Benedetto for a while. He was, correct me if I'm wrong, and he made him a character in a novel. That's right.
Sensini, a short story, Sensini.
A short story. Which one was?
Sensini. It's called Sensini. And Sensini
yeah.
is Di Benedetto, like very recognizably Di Benedetto. Although it's in the story, it's not the writer who was in jail in the Dirty War. It's his son. So it's like this younger self. But I mean, I think that there was this move. I mean, it's hard to say whether the influence happens because people were moving away from magical realism anyway. But it's hard to just name a single writer because basically Latin American literature does not do magical realism anymore, serious Latin American writers. And, and Di Benedetto is pivotal in that shift away from magical realism. I mean, for example, Chris Andrews beautifully translates Selva Almada, who's starting to get more and more recognition here, and very deservedly. And I associate her with Di Benedetto because she actually wrote a book about the filming of the Lucrecia Martel film based on Zama, which is very much in the terse Di Benedetto manner. But I think in her writing, which is spare, which is local, which is regional, you definitely see a huge influence of Di Benedetto. I mean, I haven't discussed it with her, maybe Chris has, but in a lot of ways, stylistically, I think that there's definitely an influence there. And someone like Selva Almada and many other young Argentines.
Yeah, and don't forget, as you said before, Ricardo Piglia.
Right.
Ricardo Piglia, as like a lot of people know, he's one of the best Latin American readers of the century. And he claimed that there were two authors in Argentina that it has to be in the canon, and they were not at that time. One was Roberto Arlt, and the other one was Di Benedetto. And he wrote a lot about them. And actually, I think Roberto Piglia was very important in this shifting Di Benedetto to the canon. Yeah. I don't know if you agree with this. But.
Oh, absolutely. And Čajfek, Sergio Čajfek. Yeah. Yeah. I think that Čajfek, I've discussed Čajfek's admiration for Di Benedetto, the influence of Di Benedetto. And in fact, Čajfek wrote an introduction, just as Saer wrote an introduction, Čajfek wrote an introduction to the first publication of the entire trilogy in one volume, which has now happened a couple of times. Again, Čajfek has this very regional, very spare, very silent mode of writing, often very silent. Much left unsaid. So I would definitely add his name. The list is very long. We could go on. Yeah. Shall we do another question?
Yes, that's a great answer. And we have a good question from Susan Bernofsky. She asks, is it more fun to translate descriptions of loud things or quiet things?
Well, obviously the vocabulary of noise in this book was really fun to deal with because, all of these words of, buzzing and, the whole onomatopoeia, right? There's an onomatopoeia in language that mimics noises. But do we have an onomatopoeia of silence? I'm not sure, just the blank space on the page, the ellipses. So yeah, Susan, good point. Very fun to translate descriptions of noise.
I imagine. I think maybe one more question. I was wondering, what can you tell us about the third entry in the Trilogy of Expectation? Can we expect something from you soon?
Well, I'm working. I'm almost done with the translation. I think that New York Review of Books will probably take it's good to leave some space, between the volumes. So it might be a while before it comes out. In some ways, the third volume is the one, it's the one that I'm most uncomfortable with, but it's also the one that most confirms my sense that that Di Benedetto, and I'm just going to leave everybody with this, and it might seem very strange to people, especially those who are familiar with Los Suicidas, that there is a very powerful feminist impulse in Di Benedetto's writing, and that these silenced women, I mean, I think it's one of the things that Lucrecia Martel really captured in the movie Zama. You have all these people in the movie who are silenced, who belong to classes of people that are silenced, slaves, indigenous people, women of a certain class. You know, there's some women who are allowed to speak, but others who are not. And they're there on screen and the camera dwells on them. You see them, even though they can't speak, even though they're not allowed to speak, you see them. And in some sense, that's what happens in this novel with the wife, with Nina, whom he marries. You watch her sort of be destroyed, you know, from afar through this perception of the narrator, but she's being destroyed, and somehow you have there is a sympathy for her within the narration. The narrator is sort of clear-eyed about the fact that she's being destroyed, and clear-eyed about the gender expectations. It's another reason why I'm very happy that I chose to translate espera as expectation. I'm clear-eyed about the gender expectations that are destroying them both in some way. And I think with Los Suicidas, that moves into the foreground. So that's my view. That's my 5-minute
what Esther says, we tend to think that the Argentinian type is a guy who is a little wordy and speaks a lot and loud and everything. But Lucrecia Martel has pointed very good in Zama, in the movie, and this spirit of Di Benedetto's novel, that there are a lot of regions in Argentina that people just don't talk too much, you know? For instance, this very region of Argentina, Misiones, in the border with Paraguay and Brazil, which was the same landscape in which Lucrecia Martel shot her movie, is all this Guaranese indigenous tradition, and these people don't speak at all, you know? You have to, I mean, you never know what they're thinking, for instance, you know? I mean, it's absolutely out of the prototype of the prejudice people used to have about Argentina.
And yeah, I think that Martel was also right that there is there's a concern with indigeneity. It's there in Zama. Obviously, in El Silenciero, it's in a world where indigeneity simply isn't visible. There's nobody indigenous in it. But somehow reading it as part of a trilogy makes you realize that something has been erased, right? If you read it after Zama. So that's another reason why I really like Saer's gesture of making these 3 books a trilogy, because when you read them as a single whole, you become aware of what's been erased, what's been lost as history moved on, you know, what you're no longer seeing. You no longer see the slaves in El Silenciero, but because you read Zama, you know that the slaves were there, right? So I think it was a brilliant gesture. And to the extent that I can speak for Di Benedetto, I feel that he approves of it.
Great. Well, it's good to know that we'll have something to look forward to, something more to look forward to once we've all finished reading the Silentiary. I think that's all the time that we have for this evening, but thank you both so much for this really wonderful conversation. It's been a blast. Those of you at home, please consider purchasing a copy of the Silentiary from Community Bookstore. We hope to see you at another virtual event very soon. Thanks again, and have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you so much for coming, everybody. And Andrés, thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Enjoy the summer. Enjoy the sailing. I'm so jealous. I'm so jealous.
I know.
Well, and it's just incredible how many people were here. It's just wonderful to have had you all. So
thanks all. Good night.
Good night, everybody.